Hey, that last video certainly caught a lot of you guys. Muslims took an awful lot of replies and comments about it. And it's fascinating to see how really in many respects you're having a problem with it. Because when you look at the Bible that we consider to be basically equivalent to your traditions, the question you need to ask then, what is your Word of God? Well, you believe this is it right here. The Qur'an is your Word of God. And you believe that this is co-eternal with God. According to Sura 85, ayah 22, that it is the eternal Qur'an, and it's the eternal Word. Well, what's our equivalent? It's not the Bible. And I said that quite categorically, and many of you have thrown out all kinds of accusations. Mr. Smith, so you now believe the Bible is not the Word of God. No, this is not. Using your definition, it's not the Word of God as you're claiming. So where is our Word of God? I said it in the video. Jesus Christ. He is the Word of God. How do I know that? Well, the Bible tells me so. It's the Bible that I go to that it defines who Jesus is. In fact, let me go to John 1, chapter 1, verse 1 through 4, and then I'll jump to 14. And this is what it says. In the beginning was the Word. Who is the Word? The Word was with God, and the Word was God. So, who's our Word of God? He is with God, and He is God. He was with God in the very beginning. Through Him all things were made. So, through the Word all things were made. Without Him nothing was made that has been made. In Him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. Who are we talking about here? Well, let's go down to verse 14. Let's get more specific. The Word became flesh and lived for a while among us. So, who's the Word of God? You know good well who this is talking about. This is Jesus, who is the Word of God. We have seen His glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. So, let's get the parallels again. Your Word of God, if you claim that this is your Word, what's the equivalent? Using your definition, our equivalent is Jesus Christ. Now, let's do a comparison between these two words of God. Your case, you believe that this Word of God is eternal, because you see that in Surah 85, ayah 22. Well, we see in John 1:1 that Jesus is the eternal Word of God. He claims to be pre-existent even before Abraham. In John 8:58, before Abraham was, I am. There's the personal name for God. That proves that He is long before Abraham. You claim that this Quran, the Word, is perfect. Well, we know that the only perfect thing, the only that which is perfect, is Jesus Himself. Jesus is our perfect Word of God. Even your Quran admits that in Surah 19, ayah 19, which delineates that Jesus is the perfect one. Your Word of God, is it a paradigm for all time? Is it relevant for today? Well, take a look at its pages and just take a look at what it says, and you will see that you can basically divide this book into two halves. And when you look at the first half, in this case, this part, that is the Medinan surahs. That is not relevant for today, and that's where many of the problems lie in that first section, that last, basically, from 622 to 632, the last 10 years of the Prophet's life. It does not make sense when it comes to violence, enormous amount of violence, over 149 verses on violence. When it deals with women's issues, look at what it says about women. You may beat them, Surah 434. You must not accept their word equal to men in Surah 2, ayah 282. You've got, they have not the same witness in court. And we also know that they get half the inheritance. That reference there that supports and shows that they have half the ability of man. But also Surah 2, ayah 223. Boy, there's a real confusion in that one. Surah 2, ayah 223, which stipulates that women are nothing more than tilth, sexual object for men to go into whenever they want. So obviously it is not relevant for today. Jesus is absolutely relevant today. Show me one thing about Jesus that's irrelevant, that does not make sense. He is our paradigm for all time in all places. That bracelet that many Christians wear, WWJD, what would Jesus do, is a great example of exactly what we're saying. Jesus is relevant, and everything we do, we look to Jesus as our model, as our paradigm. We look to Him to see how we're to act in everything, how we're to think, how we're to live. You look to the Quran and you can basically throw out half of it. You only can look at the Meccan surahs, and they don't tell you much of how to live today. There's not much of a model there to follow. So your word comes up lacking. What about relational? Well, the fact that Jesus, as the Word of God, is absolutely relational. It is God with us, Emmanuel. Prophesied in Isaiah 7:14 that He would come from a virgin, and that would be a sign for us. His name would be Emmanuel, God with us, defines Him as such, proves that our Word of God is somebody who comes down and lives with us, someone who mediates for us, someone who is relational with us, Try to see if you can find those definitions with this book here. Absolutely makes no sense. In fact, you can see suddenly now your Word of God comes up lacking in almost every category. Your Word of God is very formal. It's a book. You read it. It's full of rules and regulations, institutions, that most of which you can't even follow. That's one of your problems in trying to be relevant today. Now let's see, what else can we do a parallel with? Well, was Jesus known about before he came to earth? Was the Qur'an known about before it came to earth? No, there's no reference about this book coming down beforehand. There's no one really knows whether or not this is the book that is eternal, except for one verse, Surah 85:22, that stipulates it. Everything we know about this book, according to you, comes from one man. His name is Muhammad, an illiterate man. He couldn't even read or write it himself. Had others had to do it, and was not even compiled when he was living. That was done 20 years after his death. Goodness sakes, Jesus Christ. He is our Word of God. He is our representative of God. He is God. He is God in the flesh. What better way for God to tell us of who he is than to send himself? What better way for him to reveal himself than to become himself? That's the perfect Word of God that came 2,000 years ago, spent 33 years living on earth so we could see him, so we could know him, so we could relate to him. Take a look and see there's no parallel whatsoever. No, I'm sorry. There is a parallel. There's no comparison between your Word and our Word. What is another one? Can he be criticized? Can you criticize this word? Try it. See what happens if you criticize this word in a Muslim context. Look and see what they have in places like Pakistan. Just use that, the 295C law, which stipulates that if you criticize this book, it's a capital offense. Can you criticize Jesus Christ? Absolutely. He was criticized by people who knew him. He was criticized by those who whipped him. He was criticized and put on the cross by those who hated him. And still today he's being criticized by many of you even. We allow him to be criticized. He allows himself to be criticized. That's the kind of word we have. He allows himself to be criticized, but in every criticism he comes up roses. No wonder we can't criticize this book, because when you start to do it, you start to see there's all kinds of problems with it. That's why I can understand you have these rules and regulations stipulating that you may not do so. Now let's get to the last category, which I think is the most important. When you look at the two words, the Word of God that you believe is the Qur'an, our Word of God, who is Jesus Christ, a person versus a book. What did they come to do? Well, this book over here came to basically teach you about who God is. But when you stop and even look at it, it is full of contradictions, full of errors. We're going to get into that later. I'm not going to really support that right now. I don't have time in this video. What's more, it's cold and formal. Does nothing for me. Absolutely nothing for me. And you have to, in order to read it properly, you have to read it in the Arabic language. It comes from a foreign place with a foreign language. How does that meet my needs? What about Jesus as my perfect Word? What did he come to do? Well, Jesus absolutely confronts this kind of word and says, I've come for a very good reason. What did he come 2,000 years ago to do? Well, he came down to die on the cross for me. He came to sacrifice. The Word of God we're looking at comes and sacrifices himself. He basically took upon himself my sins. Isaiah 53 prophesied that. It was fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. What a word he is. Oh, what an eternal word he is. What a mediator he is. How relational and how relevant he is for today. Now, do these comparisons, folks. If you do want to say that the Quran is perfect and ideal, compare him with our word, Jesus Christ, and there is no comparison. Your God tells you that you must die for him, sends his sons to die for him. My God sends his son to die for me. Take a look and you ask, which one would you rather follow? Which one would you rather believe? Which Word of God really is the true, universal, applicable for every day, age, and hour, every time, for every people? And I would say there's only one answer, and that's Jesus Christ. He's my Word of God. I offer him to you. Come back with me on it, and you tell me which is better, because you know good and well it comes right back to Jesus Christ. Come on home to Jesus, and you'll find the true eternal Word of God, who has died for you 2,000 years ago, so that you can know him intimately for eternity. There you go.